I smiled, while 27 people laughed around a table I helped build. My name card was pushed to the far end, my presence reduced to an afterthought, my worth quietly rewritten in front of witnesses. When my own family called me a burden, something inside me went very still. That was the moment I understood the truth. I was only welcome when I was useful, only valued when I carried what they did not want to hold. I did not argue. I did not cry. I smiled, walked out into the cold night and texted one name that changed everything. Before we step into today's story, drop a quick comment and let us know where you're joining us from. We're always amazed by how these stories connect people across different cultures and places. Your voice in the comments keeps this community alive, so don't hold back. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll always be the first to catch our latest tales. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready for a journey that might just change the way you see things. Let's dive in. My name is Evelyn Brooks. I am 71 years old, and for most of my life, I believed I understood the difference between independence and loneliness. After my husband died, I stayed in our house in Portland, Oregon, the one we had lived in for more than 3 decades. It was not large or impressive, but it was steady. I knew every creak in the floorboards, every place the light shifted in the afternoon. I had routines that held me together: morning coffee by the window, volunteer shifts at the library, slow walks through my neighborhood where people still knew my name. I had worked for years as an administrative manager in a hospital. Paperwork never scared me. Structure comforted me. I was not reckless with money or decisions. I lived on my pension and savings carefully, not extravagantly, but without fear. The house was paid off. My life was quiet, but it was mine, and that mattered to me more than I realized at the time. My son, Matthew, lived in Boulder, Colorado. He was 43, confident, and busy building something he was proud of. He co-founded a consulting firm focused on renewable energy, a business he spoke about with conviction and ambition. I admired that about him. I had always admired him. When his father died, Matthew began calling more often. At first, it felt thoughtful. Then it felt concerned. Then it began to sound like worry. He asked questions about winter storms, about icy sidewalks, about whether I ever felt unsafe being alone. I answered honestly. Some days were harder than others, but I was managing. Still, his calls carried a steady message. He did not say it outright, but the idea took shape between us. I should not be alone anymore. When he finally asked me to move closer, he framed it gently. He talked about family, about being near his children, about how much it would mean to them to have their grandmother nearby. He said I would not need to give anything up. He said I could keep my independence while being closer to people who loved me. He made it sound less like a change and more like a continuation of care. I hesitated longer than he expected. Portland held my memories. It held my marriage. It held the version of myself that knew where she stood. But grief has a way of wearing you down quietly. It makes questions feel heavier than they used to. Eventually, the idea of being closer to family began to sound like relief instead of risk. Selling the house was harder than I admitted. Signing the papers felt final in a way I had not prepared for. I told myself I was choosing connection over solitude, that I was being practical, not sentimental. When I packed my belongings, I told myself that a house was only walls and that family was what mattered now. Matthew's home in Boulder was larger than anything I had ever owned. Behind it sat a small guest house, separate but close enough to feel included. He described it as perfect for me. Private, comfortable, mine. When I first arrived, everything looked clean and welcoming. I felt grateful. I felt taken care of. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed, I told myself I had made a wise choice. I believed I was stepping into a chapter defined by closeness and security. I did not know then that safety and belonging are not the same thing, or that one can be offered while the other is quietly withdrawn. If you're still watching and starting to sense something is not quite right beneath the surface, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me, because what looked like a loving invitation was actually the first step into something far more dangerous. Now, let's move on to Chapter 2. The first few weeks in Boulder passed quietly. I settled into the guest house behind my son's home and told myself I was doing exactly what I had promised, living independently while being close. I cooked my own meals most days, kept my space neat, and made a point not to interrupt the rhythm of the main house. I wanted to be present without being intrusive, grateful without being dependent. That balance mattered to me. At first, Matthew and his wife included me easily enough. We shared a few dinners. I watched the children after school once or twice. I told myself that the rest of the time apart was simply busy schedules colliding. Everyone had work. Everyone had obligations. I did not expect to be the center of anything. But over time, the patterns shifted in ways that were subtle enough to excuse. Family dinners became less frequent. Plans were made without mention of me, then explained afterward as last-minute decisions. I noticed conversations stopping when I entered a room, not out of secrecy, I assumed, but convenience. The guest house began to feel less like a choice and more like a boundary. Rachel talked often about expenses, utilities, groceries, the cost of running a household with children and demanding jobs. She never accused me directly, but the message hovered. Things were tighter now. I responded the way I always had, by smoothing the edges. I paid for groceries when I shopped. I covered small household needs before anyone had to ask. It felt easier to give quietly than to risk being perceived as a burden. Matthew began talking more about his company. The energy sector was unpredictable, he said. Projects were promising, but slow to pay. Cash flow required creativity. I listened, nodding, proud of his ambition and relieved that he trusted me enough to share his worries. When he mentioned that some opportunities were just out of reach because of technical requirements, I asked what he meant. That was when he introduced the idea. His company, he explained, could qualify for federal funding if it had a controlling shareholder who fit certain criteria. An older woman with a stable financial background, someone reputable, someone like me. He was careful with his words, presenting it as a formality rather than a responsibility. My name would help them open doors, nothing more. He reassured me that it would not change my life in any real way. I would not be managing anything. I would not be exposed to risk. It was simply a matter of paperwork, and paperwork was something I understood. I had spent decades signing documents that kept hospitals running smoothly. This felt familiar, almost comforting. I hesitated, though, not because I suspected him, but because something in me recognized the weight of permanence. Matthew sensed that pause and softened his tone. He framed it as a shared future, a way for me to be part of something meaningful while still maintaining my independence. He reminded me that family helped family. I did not consult an attorney. I did not ask for a second opinion. I trusted my son. I trusted the version of myself that believed love and transparency went hand in hand. When I signed the documents, I told myself I was being practical and supportive, not sentimental. Afterward, nothing appeared different on the surface. Life continued, but inside me, something shifted. I felt a strange mix of usefulness and unease, pride and uncertainty. I had stepped into a role I did not fully understand, not because I was forced, but because I wanted to belong. Looking back, I see those moments clearly. At the time, they felt harmless. Small adjustments, reasonable compromises. I told myself that families evolve, that roles change, and that trust should not be questioned without cause. What I did not yet understand was that silence can become consent, and consent can quietly reshape your place in the world without asking if you are ready. If you're still here and beginning to notice the subtle shifts that most people ignore until it's too late, comment number 2 below. This is where small warnings start adding up, and what happens next changes everything. Let's move on to chapter 3. After I signed the documents, life appeared to settle back into its familiar rhythm. I kept my routine small and orderly, the way I always had. Mornings began with coffee at my table in the guest house, afternoons with errands or reading, evenings quiet unless I was invited into the main house. I told myself that if nothing felt urgent, nothing must be wrong. Still, a low unease followed me. I noticed small changes in my bank statements, slight withdrawals that did not line up with anything I remembered authorizing. The amounts were not large enough to set off alarms, just consistent enough to make me pause. I assumed they were automatic payments, service fees, the kind of background noise money makes when you are not watching it closely. I had no reason, I told myself, to suspect anything else. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped through the slot beside my door. The envelope was plain, official in a way that made my shoulders tighten before I even opened it. I stood at the small counter in my kitchen, sunlight cutting across the floor, and stared at my name printed neatly on the front. It felt heavier than paper should. I opened it slowly. The words blurred at first, then sharpened into meaning. The letter was from the Internal Revenue Service. It referenced a federal energy grant, compliance documentation, and potential discrepancies under review. Halfway down the page, my name appeared again, listed as the responsible filer associated with the grant application. I read that sentence 3 times before it sank in. Responsible filer. The phrase landed with a quiet, devastating clarity. I was being notified because, on paper, I was accountable. Not my son, not his partners, me. I sat down at the table, the chair scraping softly against the floor. I had not filed anything. I had not submitted reports or signed off on financial disclosures. I did not even have access to the systems mentioned in the letter. And yet there it was, written plainly, without emotion or context, as if responsibility were simply a fact that followed my name wherever it appeared. Fear did not come all at once. It arrived in layers. First disbelief, then confusion, then a sharp awareness of what words like inquiry and review could mean. I folded the letter carefully and walked across the yard to the main house, the paper pressed flat in my palm as if that might contain it. Matthew was home, working in his office. I handed him the letter without raising my voice. I expected surprise, maybe concern. Instead, he skimmed it quickly and shrugged. He said these notices were common, part of the process when dealing with federal funding. He told me not to worry, that it would be handled. What struck me most was not what he said, but how he said it. There was no hesitation, no urgency. The letter did not seem new to him. It felt like something he had anticipated, perhaps even prepared for. He returned it to me with a calm that did not match the weight of the words printed on the page. I walked back to my guest house with the letter tucked under my arm, my steps measured and deliberate. I told myself that panic would not help. I had spent my career solving problems by understanding them, not by reacting to fear. Still, as I sat again at my table, the quiet pressed in around me. For the first time since moving to Boulder, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had avoided. That the version of events I understood was incomplete. That my trust, so freely given, might be serving a purpose I had not agreed to. I did not yet know what to do with that realization, but I knew this much. My name had been placed somewhere it did not belong, and silence would not remove it. If you're still watching and realizing this was never just about family, comment number 3 below to let me know you're following closely. Because the truth I uncovered next was not emotional, it was legal, and it put everything at risk. Now let's move on to chapter 4. After the letter arrived, I did not confront anyone again. I did not raise my voice or demand explanations. I moved through my days the same way I always had, quietly and deliberately, as if nothing inside me had shifted. On the surface, life continued without interruption. Inside, however, something had changed. The calm I once trusted had thinned, replaced by a careful attentiveness I could not turn off. I began reviewing the documents I had signed, pulling copies from the folder I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk. I read them slowly this time, without the reassurance of my son's voice explaining what mattered and what did not. Sentences that once seemed harmless now felt heavier. Phrases like controlling shareholder and compliance responsibility stood out in a way they had not before. I realized how much I had skimmed, how often trust had filled in the gaps where clarity should have been. Part of me still wanted to believe this was a misunderstanding, that Matthew knew what he was doing and that the letter was just an inconvenience. But belief did not erase the facts. My name was attached to obligations I did not oversee. That was not emotional. It was structural. I decided not to involve my family while I tried to understand what was happening. I did not want to accuse anyone prematurely. I told myself that knowledge did not have to mean confrontation. It could simply mean preparation. So I searched quietly, following bulletin boards at the library, scanning community notices until I found a listing for a free legal consultation for older adults dealing with financial responsibility issues. The meeting was held in a small community room with folding chairs and fluorescent lighting. The people there looked like me, retired, careful, uneasy in ways they had not expected to be at this stage of life. The attorney spoke plainly, without drama, explaining how titles on paper carry consequences regardless of intent. She talked about federal oversight, about how responsibility follows documentation, not family hierarchy. As I listened, pieces began to fall into place. The words from the letter no longer felt abstract. They had shape now, meaning. When the session ended, I stayed behind and asked a few questions. I did not share my full story. I did not need to. The answers were clear enough. A few days later, I scheduled a private consultation with a financial attorney who specialized in federal grant compliance. I brought my documents, my letter, and a list of questions I had written out the night before. He reviewed everything carefully, his expression neutral but focused. When he explained my position, he did not soften the truth. On paper, I was not symbolic. I was accountable. He advised me to protect myself immediately, not out of anger or distrust, but because responsibility without oversight is exposure. He suggested I make copies of everything, save correspondence, and begin separating my personal finances from anything connected to the company. He did not tell me what to do about my son. He simply reminded me that legal systems do not weigh intention the way families do. That afternoon, I went to a bank across town and opened a new account. I did not announce it. I did not justify it. I just did it. It felt strange, almost disloyal, even though I knew it was neither. It was precaution. When I returned to the guest house, nothing looked different. The yard was quiet. The house stood exactly as it had the day before, but I understood something I had not allowed myself to consider until then. Silence was no longer neutral. It was a choice, and so was awareness. If I was going to remain calm, it would be because I was informed, not because I was avoiding the truth. If you're still here and feeling the tension building, comment number 4 below. This is the last calm moment before everything explodes in plain sight, and the next chapter takes us straight into the turning point. Let's continue to chapter 5. By the time December settled over Boulder, the house no longer felt like a place I lived. It felt like a stage being prepared for something that did not include me. Matthew announced the New Year's Eve party as if it were a given, a natural extension of his growing business and expanding circle. He spoke about it with energy, listing names and plans, while I listened from the edge of the conversation, absorbing details that were not meant for my input. The days leading up to the party were filled with activity. Deliveries arrived. Decorations appeared in careful arrangements meant to suggest success without excess. Rachel moved through the house with focus and precision, concerned with impressions rather than comfort. I stayed in the guest house, watching from a distance, aware that my role was to remain unobtrusive. I told myself that this was fine, that not every event needed my presence at the center. On the night itself, the house filled quickly. Voices overlapped, glasses clinked. Laughter echoed through rooms I rarely entered anymore. I dressed carefully, not to stand out, but not to disappear. When I stepped inside, few people noticed. Those who did offered polite smiles before turning back to conversations already in motion. I was not introduced as anything in particular. Not a partner, not a supporter, just Matthew's mother, present but undefined. I found my place at a table set slightly apart from the main gathering, close enough to hear fragments of conversation, far enough to be excluded from them. From that vantage point, I watched my son move confidently through the room, telling his story with ease. At some point, he spoke about the past year, about challenges, about growth, about the pressure of building a company while managing personal responsibilities. When he mentioned caring for an aging parent, the room responded with sympathetic nods. I felt the story shift in real time, reshaping itself around a version of events that positioned me as context rather than contributor. Then came the moment I had not prepared for. One of the guests, someone familiar with federal funding processes, glanced in my direction and asked about my role in the grant compliance structure. The question was casual, professional, and completely unguarded. It landed in the room like a dropped object, drawing attention without sound. All eyes turned toward me. I waited for Matthew to speak, to clarify, to place the question where it belonged. He did not. He stood there, glass in hand, allowing the pause to stretch. In that silence, something crystallized. I understood that my presence was useful when it absorbed responsibility, and invisible when it required acknowledgement. I answered carefully, offering nothing beyond what was necessary. The conversation moved on, but the shift remained. I felt it in the way people looked at me afterward, with curiosity rather than familiarity, with assessment rather than warmth. The house was full, yet I had never felt more alone inside it. I stayed for a while longer, long enough not to draw attention, then excused myself quietly. Outside, the cold air cleared my head. Snow reflected the lights from the windows, softening the edges of everything I had just witnessed. I did not feel angry. I felt awake. Standing there, I recognized the pattern I had been resisting. The small exclusions, the careful omissions, the way my name carried weight only in documents, not in rooms like this. That night did not create the truth. It revealed it. As I walked back toward the guest house, I understood that something irreversible had occurred. Not a confrontation, not a scene, but a shift in how I saw myself within my own family. I had crossed from participant to liability without ever agreeing to the change. And once you see that clearly, there is no way to return to pretending you belong where your presence is only tolerated. I left the house without saying goodbye. There was no announcement, no explanation offered to anyone who might have noticed. The noise from inside followed me only as far as the door. Once it closed, the sound dissolved into the cold, and what remained was stillness. Snow had begun to fall again, fine and quiet, the kind that settles without asking permission. I stood for a moment on the walkway, breathing in air that felt sharp enough to be honest. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. Not numb, not detached, but clear. The night inside had not wounded me so much as it had clarified something I had been resisting for months. I had been telling myself that each moment stood alone, that small slights were just misunderstandings, that patience would eventually be rewarded. Standing there in the cold, I understood that the party was not the problem. It was the proof. I thought about the silence when the question had been asked, the way my name had been allowed to carry weight without support. I thought about how easily responsibility had been placed on me and how quickly recognition had been withheld. That balance had not tipped by accident. It had been arranged. I remembered the attorney's words from weeks earlier, spoken without drama or judgment. Responsibility follows documentation, not intent. The timing matters. Waiting can become consent. At the time, those sentences had sounded like guidance. Now they felt like a warning that had finally reached me. I did not feel angry with my son in that moment. Anger would have implied surprise. What I felt was the absence of hope that things would correct themselves if I just waited long enough. The risk was no longer theoretical. It had a shape. It had my name on it. I took out my phone and unlocked the screen. The contact was already there, saved simply and without decoration. I did not scroll or hesitate. I did not rehearse what I would say. There was nothing left to explain. I typed a single word and pressed send. The message left my phone without ceremony, as quiet as the snow falling around me. I did not wait to see if it was delivered. I did not check for a response. That decision had already been made long before this night, assembled piece by piece through documents, letters, and moments of dismissal I had tried to excuse. This was not an act of retaliation. It was the final step in choosing to stop absorbing consequences meant for someone else. I walked back toward the guest house slowly. Each step felt deliberate, grounded. When I closed the door behind me, the space felt different. Smaller, perhaps, but also mine in a way it had not been before. I set my phone down on the table and did not look at it again. Lying in bed later, I replayed the night not with regret, but with a strange sense of alignment. I had not raised my voice. I had not demanded apologies. I had not forced anyone to see me differently. I had simply acted on what I knew to be true. The decision did not make me feel powerful. It made me feel responsible in the right way, accountable to myself instead of to a story that benefited others. Whatever came next would be difficult. I was not naive about that. But difficulty chosen is different from difficulty imposed. As sleep finally came, I understood something that had taken me years to learn. Protecting yourself does not require cruelty. Sometimes it requires nothing more than recognizing when your presence has been reduced to utility and deciding, quietly and firmly, that this is where it ends. If you're still watching and felt the weight of that one decision, comment number 6 below, so I know you're still with me. Because the message was sent, the line was crossed, and what happened next was immediate and irreversible. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. The morning after New Year's Day arrived without ceremony. The sky was pale and still, the kind of quiet that makes ordinary sounds feel louder than they are. I woke early, not from anxiety, but from habit. For the first time in weeks, my thoughts did not scatter. They lined up neatly, as if they had been waiting for permission to settle. My phone began to vibrate before I finished my coffee. I did not pick it up right away. The screen lit again and again on the table, the rhythm irregular, insistent. I already knew who it was. I did not need to look to understand the shift that had begun. Silence had done its work. When I finally checked, there were missed calls and messages, some from my son, others from numbers I did not recognize. I read none of them closely. The content did not matter as much as the pattern. Confusion had arrived first, then urgency. The order told me everything I needed to know. Outside, son, the main house was quiet at first. Then, not long after, a car door slammed. Footsteps crossed the yard with speed that did not bother to hide its purpose. Matthew knocked once, sharply, and then opened the guest house door without waiting. His face was tight, his movements abrupt, as if he were trying to outrun something catching up to him. He spoke quickly, words overlapping, questions stacking on top of each other. Accounts were inaccessible, cards were being declined. A partner had called asking about management changes. I listened without interrupting, without correcting his assumptions. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain my reasoning. I did not apologize. What struck me was not his anger, but his certainty that I should fix this. That expectation had been there for a long time, woven into every request I had answered quietly, every gap I had filled without being asked. Now that I had stepped back, the absence felt to him like betrayal. Rachel joined him shortly after, her frustration sharper, her accusations less measured. She spoke of damage, of embarrassment, of what people would think. I noticed that neither of them spoke about responsibility, only about loss, not what had been done, but what was being taken away. I remained seated, my hands folded in my lap. There was sadness in me, but it did not bend into guilt. I could see clearly now that what was collapsing had been built on an imbalance I did not create. The foundation had shifted long before I sent that message. I had simply stopped holding it up. Eventually, they left. The door closed behind them with less force than it had opened, as if the energy that carried them in had begun to drain away. The yard returned to stillness. I sat alone, listening to the quiet I had chosen. As the day unfolded, the signs continued. More calls, more messages. None of them altered what had already been set in motion. The systems they depended on were responding to documentation, not emotion. That distinction mattered. It always had. I went about my afternoon as planned. I walked. I read. I made a simple meal. The world did not end because I stopped absorbing its weight. It adjusted. When the sun dipped low and light slanted across the floor, I understood something that surprised me. I was not relieved exactly. Relief suggests escape. What I felt was alignment. My actions finally matched what I knew to be true. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of consequence, full of clarity. And for the first time since arriving in Boulder, the quiet belonged to me, not as a retreat, but as the result of choosing to step out of a story that had never included me on equal terms. The days after New Year's blurred together, not because they were chaotic, but because they were oddly restrained. The initial shock had passed. What remained was a slow unraveling, quiet and procedural. I stayed in the guest house, but mentally, I had already stepped outside the role I had been playing. I watched events unfold with a distance that felt unfamiliar and necessary. Matthew stopped coming over in person. The urgency in his messages softened into something else, a careful tone that tried to sound reasonable. He asked if we could talk. He suggested compromises. He hinted at solutions that required time, patience, and trust. I read each message once and did not respond. I had learned that waiting had always worked in his favor, not mine. My attorney called with updates. Everything was proceeding as expected, he said. Accounts had been flagged, documentation reviewed, transitions initiated. Then his voice changed slightly, the way it does when a professional is about to explain something they know will not land gently. He told me there was one more matter that required immediate attention. He had reviewed additional filings connected to my name. Not business documents this time, but a personal guarantee tied to a loan. The loan had been used to purchase the main house, my son's house. My name was listed as a secondary guarantor, a backstop in case of default. I sat at the small table in my guest house and listened as he explained what that meant in plain terms. If the company collapsed or the loan was called due to instability, my pension and savings could be frozen. Everything I had worked for could be pulled into a situation I did not create and could not control. The room felt smaller as he spoke, not because of fear, but because something settled into certainty. This was not an oversight. It was a pattern. My stability had been used as insulation quietly and efficiently. The attorney outlined my options. None of them were painless, but one was clear. I could withdraw my guarantee and transfer responsibility back to the borrower where it belonged. It was legal. It was justified. It would also remove the last safety net my son had been relying on without acknowledging. I agreed. Not immediately, not impulsively, but with a calm that surprised me. I understood what this would mean. There would be no soft landing after this, no room for reinterpretation. The story would end the way it had been written. After the call, I began to prepare in practical ways. I looked at listings in nearby towns. I measured my furniture. I started sorting through belongings, separating what I would take from what I would leave behind. I did this quietly, without announcing my plans. I had learned that explanation invites negotiation, and negotiation was no longer appropriate. The guest house felt temporary now, like a waiting room rather than a home. I moved through it with intention, packing items that carried meaning and leaving behind what belonged to a chapter that was closing. I was not angry. I was resolved. In the evenings, I sat by the window and watched the lights in the main house turn on and off. I wondered when they would notice that my presence had shifted from convenient to unavailable. I did not wonder how they would feel about it. That part no longer guided my decisions. What became clear to me in those days was this: waiting to be treated fairly had kept me exposed. Choosing to leave was not abandonment. It was alignment. I was no longer interested in surviving within someone else's structure. I was preparing to build my own again, quietly, deliberately, and without apology. If you're still here and ready to see how this all ends, comment number 8 below. The choice has been made, the exit is already in motion, and the final chapters reveal what freedom really cost and why it was worth everything. Let's move on to the conclusion. I moved out on a morning that felt suspended between seasons, gray and quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I had chosen the timing carefully, not for symbolism, but because everything that needed to be settled had already been settled. The documents were signed, the guarantees withdrawn, the responsibilities that were never truly mine had been returned to where they belonged. All that remained was the physical act of leaving. I packed my car slowly, deliberately. I took what mattered and left what did not. Clothes I actually wore. Books that had followed me through decades of moves. Photographs with worn edges and familiar faces. I did not take anything that could be argued over later. I was done negotiating my presence through objects. What I carried needed to be unquestionably mine. The main house was silent. My son and his wife were gone, and I did not wait for them to return. This was not avoidance. It was recognition. There are moments when goodbye requires two people standing in the same truth. We were not there. I left a short note on the kitchen counter, written plainly, without explanation or apology. I thanked them for the space I had used and said I was moving into my own place nearby. Nothing more. I had learned that explanations invite arguments, and arguments invite erosion. Driving away, I expected sadness to rush in, but it did not. What I felt was lighter than that. Not relief exactly, but release. That house had trained me to shrink in ways I had not fully noticed while I lived there. I had learned to soften my footsteps, lower my voice, and make myself useful without being seen. Leaving felt like correcting a posture I had held too long. My new apartment was modest, but it faced a small park where trees stood bare and honest in the winter light. The rooms were quiet in a way that felt welcoming rather than empty. I unpacked at my own pace, placing things where they felt right instead of where they were expected to go. I hung my photographs without asking if the walls could handle them. I made tea in a kitchen that belonged to me. In the days that followed, messages came and then slowed. Accusations softened into bargaining, then into silence. I did not respond. The systems were already moving forward, indifferent to emotion. That was the strange comfort of it. What was happening now was not personal. It was structural. I heard through others that the business was changing hands, that oversight had arrived where improvisation once ruled. The house I left behind was no longer protected by my name or my savings. I did not feel satisfaction in that knowledge. I felt clarity. Consequences do not need witnesses to be real. What surprised me most was the absence of regret. I had expected it to find me eventually, but it never did. Instead, there was a steady sense of having stepped into a life that fit. The house behind me was part of my past, but it no longer defined my future. And that distinction, once made, felt necessary rather than cruel. Freedom did not arrive with fireworks or applause. It arrived quietly, in ordinary moments that no longer carried tension. Mornings became mine again. I woke without bracing myself for someone else's expectations, without checking my phone to see who might need something from me before I had even had coffee. The silence was not empty. It was settled. I began to understand how much of my life had been shaped around being useful. Not loved, not respected, but useful. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from being valued only for what you can absorb, fix, or fund. I had mistaken that exhaustion for purpose for far too long. Letting go of it felt unfamiliar at first, like setting down a weight I had forgotten I was carrying. People asked questions, gently or otherwise. Some wanted reassurance that I was not bitter. Others wanted confirmation that I would eventually step back in and make things easier again. I did neither. I learned that you do not owe people a softened version of your truth just because they are uncomfortable with the consequences of their choices. What surprised me most was how my sense of self began to return in small, practical ways. I made plans without checking anyone else's calendar. I spent money without explaining why. I filled my days with things that did not need to prove anything to anyone. These were not grand acts of rebellion. They were corrections. I still love my children. That did not change. Love does not evaporate just because boundaries appear. But love without limits had cost me too much. I had confused endurance with devotion, silence with grace. I no longer believed that sacrificing myself was the same as being a good mother or a good woman. The night of the party no longer replayed in my mind the way it once did. The image that stayed with me was not the table, or the laughter, or the way I was positioned at the edge. It was the moment afterward, standing alone in the cold, when I chose myself without needing permission. That choice did not make me cruel. It made me honest. I smiled that night not because I was amused, but because I was done pleading to be seen. The message I sent was not an attack. It was an acknowledgement that I had reached the end of my tolerance for being diminished. One name, one decision. Everything after that followed naturally. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not about revenge or victory. It is about clarity, about recognizing when love has been used as leverage and choosing to step out of that pattern. Protecting yourself is not abandonment. It is responsibility, finally directed where it belongs. I am no longer anyone's burden. I am no longer the quiet solution to problems I did not create. I am simply a woman who chose peace over performance, truth over comfort, and herself over a role that demanded everything and returned nothing. And that choice, once made, changed everything. Some stories end with triumph, others with reconciliation, but the quietest endings often carry the deepest truth. This was never a story about conflict alone. It was about recognition, about the moment when endurance stops being a virtue and becomes a warning. There comes a time when love without boundaries turns into self-erasure, and loyalty becomes a one-sided contract that slowly empties the person who keeps paying the cost. Real strength does not always announce itself. Sometimes it appears as a decision made in silence, a step taken without applause, a refusal to keep explaining pain to people who benefit from misunderstanding it. Choosing peace over performance is not weakness, it is clarity, and clarity has a way of reshaping a life from the inside out. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. Do not forget to like, follow, and subscribe so you do not miss the next story.